Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Algebra 1 Tutorials with Alina Ali. If you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Today we're learning about key attributes of function. We're going to do this video in two parts since there's a lot to cover, and so this is day 1 of key attributes of functions. Let's get started. So the first part of key attributes of functions is the actual functions themselves. So we have 3 different types. We have linear, quadratic, and exponential functions. So each one of these 3 types of functions has what we like to call a parent function. And so that is the very basic type of that either linear, quadratic, or exponential formula, and it has the basic formula. And so every other type of graph of that specific type is a transformation of the parent function. And we'll talk about transformations a little bit more in one of my later videos. And so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to graph the parent functions of each of the linear, quadratic, and exponential. And so the linear parent function on a graph looks like this. The quadratic parent function looks like this. And the exponential parent function looks like this. Now each of these graphs has an equation for its parent function. So I'm going to write out the equations for each of these parent functions. And so for a linear equation, the equation is y is equal to x. And so if you were to graph this on a graph, this would be the parent function of a linear equation. For a quadratic equation, it is y is equal to x squared. And if you graph this, this is what you get. And for an exponential equation, it is y is equal to a times b squared. We're going to talk about the definitions of the variables in the exponential functions a little bit later. And if you graphed each of these equations on a graph, you would find their parent functions. And so we're trying to find the key attributes of these functions, as in the domain and range of each of these functions, the Y-intercept, the X-intercept or intercepts, and the 0 or zeros. And so first let's start by talking about the domain and range of each of these. We talked about domain and range in our previous video, and we said that domain and range was the set of x and y coordinate values, and this could be on a data table, on a set of points, in a word problem, or on a graph. And so since we already talked about domain and range in a previous video, we're going to see some practice problems in the back. Next, let's talk about Y-intercept, X-intercepts, and zeros. And so the definitions for each of these vary, and so we're going to start with the Y-intercept, which is the coordinate point where the function crosses the y-axis. The X-intercept is really just the same thing, except instead of crossing the y-axis, it is the coordinate point where the function crosses the x-axis. And so the only difference between the two is that the Y-intercept crosses the y-axis and the X-intercept crosses the x-axis. And so next we're going to talk about what a zero is. This is not the same as like the value or the number 0. A 0 is actually the value of where the function crosses the x-axis. You can see how this is different from the X-intercept because the 0 is not written as a coordinate point. Instead, it is written as a value like 4 or 2 or 3. And so let's say we have this small little graph right here, and it wants us to find each of these, the Y-intercept, the X-intercept, and the zeros. And so let's start by finding the Y-intercept. And we said the Y-intercept is where the function crosses the y-axis, which is this vertical axis right here. And so if we mark that point right here and we label it, we can see that that coordinate point is equal to 0, -4. And so that would be our Y-intercept. Next we have our X-intercept where the function crosses the x-axis. And you can see that the function crosses the x-axis in actually 2 places, right here and right here. So we're going to want to find the value of those 2 points, or the coordinate point on the graph for those 2 points, which would be -3, comma 0 for this one right here, and 3 comma 0 for this one right here. And so those two would be our x-intercepts. For our 0, it says it's the value where the function crosses the x-axis. So where our function crosses the x-axis, you can see we have those labeled as our x-intercepts. And so to find the zeros, we're just going to take the x value of the coordinates, and that's going to be our zeros. So for our first one, the x value of the coordinate is -3. And for the second one, the x value of our coordinates is just 3. And so those two would be our zeros of this function. Let's go to the next page and do some practice problems. So for our practice problems, we have the same 3 graphs for each one of these, and for problem 1, we're going to find the domain range of each of these 3 graphs. And so let's start by finding the domain of the first one. And so we'll write D right here, and as you can see, this function has arrows at the ends which indicate they keep going in the direction that they are pointing in. And so with these arrows, you can see that no matter where they go, eventually at some point they are going to cross every x value. And so for that reason, our domain is ARN, or all real numbers, as we talked about in our last video. And the range of these, it's the same thing. You can see through these arrows that at some point our function is going to cross every y value. And so the range for this is also all real numbers. For the next one, we're going to find the domain. And so the domain over here, where since this goes off of the graph and it doesn't indicate that there's a point for it to stop, we're going to assume that these have arrows over here and that they're going to keep going in whatever direction they're going in. And again, as you can see with these arrows, they're going to cross every x value at some point. And so we can say the domain for this is also ARN, or all real numbers. The range for this one, you can see there are 2 arrows, but it stops right here. It doesn't, none of our arrows are pointing down, so nothing goes below that mark right there. And so that mark right there is actually -12. And so our range is going to be y is greater than or equal to -12. On our third one, we're going to find our domain, and it's the same concept as the last one. It goes off the page, so we're just going to assume these ones have the arrows that indicate that they keep going in the same direction they're going in. And so with these arrows, you can see that since this one is going this way and that one is pointing that way, they're going to cross every x value at some point, and so the domain is all real numbers. And for the range, you might think that since one is pointing down, one is pointing up, this has to be all real numbers too, but it's actually not. This specific type of function is the exponential function that we talked about. And so our exponential function, you can see that it approaches the x-axis over here, but it never fully touches it. And that the curve on it isn't exactly the same going both ways. The curve over here right here is a lot steeper than the curve up there. And so this exponential function is going to approach the x-axis, but it's never really going to touch the x-axis. In an exponential function, we call that the asymptote. And so the asymptote is just when in an exponential function, the value of where the function approaches but never ever touches. And so because of this asymptote, we're going to say that y is greater than 0, since it never touches the x-axis. And so instead of being greater than or equal to, it's just going to be greater than 0. And so that's going to be our range for this one. Problem number 2 says find the x-intercepts of each and the zeros of each of the following. And so we're going to start this, and we're going to find the x-intercepts and the zeros. So Let's start with finding the x-intercept of our first one. The x-intercept of this one, remember we write it as a point. And so it crosses the x-axis right here. And so that point over there is -2, 0. And so that's our x-intercept. And we said that our 0, I'm going to use z as 0. Our 0 is just the x value of the coordinate point of the x-intercept. And so our 0 here is going to be -2. And those are our x-intercepts and zeros. This one only had one x-intercept and one 0. Over here for our next one, we're going to find our x-intercept, and this one actually has 2. It crosses the graph at 2 points. Over here and over here. Our first point that we're going to use is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 0. And our next one is at 1, 2, 0. And so that is those are our x-intercepts. And again, our zeros are just going to be the x values of the coordinate points. So x values of both of these are 5 and 2, 5 and 2, and so those are our zeros. Our next one, our x-intercept, we talked about this in the above graph. In this case, the asymptote of this exponential function is at y is equal to 0. It is the x-axis. It would approach the x-axis, but it would never touch the x or cross the x-axis. And since it doesn't touch or cross the x-axis, there will not be an x-intercept. And so in this case, what we would write is that our x-intercept is DNE, or does not exist. And so if our x-intercept doesn't exist, then our 0 can't exist here either. So our zeros would not exist, does not exist. Let's go to our next one. It says, problem 3, find the y-intercept of each of the following. And so we're going to find the y-intercept of our first one, where it crosses the y-axis, and remember we're writing this as a point. And so it crosses our y-axis right here, and so our coordinate point over there is 0, 4. And so that is the y-intercept of our graph. The next one, the y-intercept, is right here. And so our y-intercept is going to be the point, and the coordinate point over here that we have is 0, -10. That's our y-intercept for this one. Our last one, the function crosses the y-axis at that point over there, and that's at 1. And so our coordinate point is going to be 0, 1. And that's the y-intercept for that one. I hope you guys understood everything going on in the video. Please like and subscribe to my channel and comment any help that you need in the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye!